All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome, welcome. We are starting our period 4. This is going to be 1800 to 1848. We're going to call this period growth, reform, and isolationism. I just want to let you know the background specifically that I chose for this time is a painting by Thomas Cole. He is one of the famous painters of the Hudson River School. He's the founder, really, of the Hudson River School. So I wanted to just speak about why this background is up right now, because obviously this is one of those areas that we don't talk a lot about but if there is any kinds of questions about American culture during this time emerging, the Hudson River School is a great example of Americana, something that comes straight out of the United States, out of this new nation, and Thomas Cole is the founder of that. So we are looking at our period for growth, reform, and isolationism. All right, some of the key dates, again, these are not ones that I necessarily have to explain to you. Please make sure you're going through these key dates. You can see it leads you through from the election of Thomas Jefferson through some very important things like the War of 1812, Missouri Compromise, the Indian Removal Act, and the Battle of Alamo. So make sure these are things that you are looking at and you are making sure you understand each of these dates. All right, so let's begin by looking at political happenings. So the nation was transitioning to a more participatory democracy during this time, and that is being achieved by the expanding suffrage from a system based on property ownership to one based on the voting of all adult white men. So it's growing, but not growing as much as we want as of today. And this is accompanied by the growth of these political parties. So we do have that election of 1800, or the revolution of 1800, which is the very first peaceful transition of power. Also politically during this time, we have the era of good feelings. So this is the election of Monroe in 1816, and this is seen as the start. This does eventually fall apart, beginning with the Panic of 1819, but we have one political party, Federalists are gone. There are also factions, though, within the Democratic Republican Party at this time. Sometimes they just call it the Republican Party. Remember, that's not the Republican Party that we think of today. That starts in the 1850s. But the factions within the Democratic Republican Party are starting to show. And this is revealed over the tensions over things like slavery and the tariff. Now, all of this is going to fall apart in the election of 1824. We also call this election the corrupt bargain. This is when John Quincy Adams becomes president following a disputed election. It is between 4 people. Henry Clay suddenly drops out. He's made Secretary of State. And then we are left with Adams, Clay, and Jackson. And Crawford, Adams, and Jackson are the strongest contenders, and Jackson wins the popular vote, but because no one wins the electoral vote, it goes to the House of Representatives. So Clay then throws his support behind Adams. He is Speaker of the House at that time, so that is one of the reasons why that happens. And boom, here we have it. All of a sudden, John Quincy Adams is president, and many people are asking how that happened, because Andrew Jackson won the popular vote. So was that a corrupt bargain with Clay, or was that politics? Well, that's for history to decide, I guess. So we see the rise of what we call the rise of common man. It's the age of Jackson. This is a very, very typical scene image of this time. It's one that I've seen on many, many AP exams. And this is, the whole idea of Jackson being king. It's called King Andrew I, and you can see there he is stomping on the Constitution of the United States and the Bank of the United States. So keep that in mind. That is an image that is very commonly seen on the AP exam. So the age of common man is when there are new state suffrage laws that allow more white men to vote. It is in response to the Panic of 1819, when irresponsible banking practices and a decreased demand for exports created a depression. Now remember, we call these depressions panics. We're not going to actually call anything a depression until the Great Depression, but that's what a panic is. A panic is a depression. So working men are most impacted by this, and they want a way to hold their representative governments responsible for what's happening. They want the ability to vote. So by 1825, most Eastern states began to lower or eliminate those property requirements. And as the property requirements are done away with, there is a huge increase in the number of people participating in the electoral process. And this leads us to the election of 1828, and we get the election of Andrew Jackson. So Andrew Jackson is one of the most controversial figures in American history. His legacy is both celebrated and reviled by numerous people, but he does champion the idea of the self-made man. He did draw, though, a color line when determining who should receive democracy and equality, and his ideas about personal and national advancement. He worked to make widespread political reform. He worked to eliminate property and religious qualifications for voting and for holding office. Um, he worked to promote a rotation in office, but he also had a massive expansion in the spoils system. He who wins governs, and that's the idea under him. Economically, he vetoed the renewal of the Second National Bank, and he led America into the Panic of 1837. Luckily for him, he is, very quickly leaving. He leaves office, and as soon as he leaves office, that's when we see the panic hit. And so he is like, "Oh, this is not my fault." And Martin Van Buren is the one who gets slammed with this. We do see a rise of a two-party system under Jackson, and it is the Democrats versus the Whigs. And they are under major disputes over the bank and the veto power of Jackson. The Democratic Party that begins in 1828 has a lot in common with the Democratic Republicans that existed from 1796 to 1824. And this new Democratic Party is led by Andrew Jackson. We then have the Whig Party. They exist from 1836 to 1852, and they have a lot in common with the Federalist Party. And the Federalist Party existed from 1796 to 1816. And at this time, they are led by that great compromiser, Henry Clay. So let's talk about the tariff. The tariff of 1828. It raised the tariff the tariff percent up to 50%. Tariff is hated by the South. In 1832, it is reaffirmed by Congress under Jackson. And this makes them extraordinarily upset throughout the South. So the Vice President of the United States under Andrew Jackson, John C. Calhoun, writes the nullification of South Carolina, and he decides, he writes the nullification papers, and South Carolina decides that they're not going to pay the taxes at all, and if the troops come, they would secede from the Union. So here we have South Carolina already stating in 1828 that they're going to leave the Union. We know they are going to be the first state to do so in 1860, but here they are already arguing to do that. We say often in this class, South Carolina's been looking for a reason to leave for a long time, okay? So they say if troops arrive, they're going to leave the Union. Congress passes the Force Bill, giving Jackson authority to use federal troops to enforce federal law in South Carolina. Jackson, though, does lower the tariff, but just to make sure that the point is made, South Carolina also nullifies the Force Bill. So they want to make sure that it's very, very clear that they are going to do what they want. That tariff, obviously, they call the tariff of abominations. At the exact same time, we also see Andrew Jackson veto the Second Bank of the United States. What does that lead to? Well, it leads to a rise of these pet banks, these wildcat banks out west that often are a little mischievous, sometimes open up and close, taking people's money, and it's going to destabilize the economy. We do also then begin to see the increased power of the federal government, and that is led by Chief Justice John Marshall. He is a Federalist. He is a Federalist holdover. He has been on the Supreme Court for a very, very long time as a Federalist judge. So understand, despite the efforts of different parts of the country to pursue their own goals, in the end, the Supreme Court is going to issue some very important decisions that are going to help increase the power of the federal government as a whole. So the first is Marbury versus Madison in 1803 that creates the idea of judicial review. This is in response to the Judiciary Act. Madison, Secretary of State, refused to deliver appointments. They sued, obviously, Marbury sues. He wants to be able to become justice of the peace. And in the end, John Marshall rules that you don't even get to have that court case, throws it out. But what's most important is he then uses it as a time to say, oh, but by the way, the Supreme Court is the final judge of all things. And so he creates the idea of judicial review, and it increases the power of the Supreme Court. Then we have McCulloch v. Maryland, where the Second Bank of the United States is deemed constitutional. It says it cannot be taxed by the federal government because it is over state governments. And as a result, it states that federal law trumps state law. It's very interesting because Andrew Jackson then argues that the Second Bank of the United States is illegal, but it was already decided in the Supreme Court case that it was not. And then we have Gibbons v. Ogden, which states that says that states do not regulate interstate commerce, that any trade between the states is actually regulated by the federal government. That decision is extraordinarily important for many reasons. We're going to even see that carry through to the civil rights movement in the 1960s as to why the federal government has the power to regulate interstate commerce. In all these cases, John Marshall is the Chief Justice. And in all these cases, it shows a vast increase in the power of the federal government. Then we have the Second Great Awakening. So this is a time of spiritual reform from within the United States. It shows that the Americans had not lost their staunch religious backgrounds, and there is religious revivalism that happens. It begins with Charles Finney. People flock to hear him in droves. It spreads across the North, and he focuses on the moral reformation of society. There are some movements that begin to then move west, and it does sweep to the west, and then there becomes a huge number of conversions out west. This is a very famous painting that shows some of those camp revival meetings that are happening. What does it do? The Second Great Awakening stresses the importance of achieving a society in which people speak about and talk about their inner souls, and also it talks about the importance of God, but of common man. Because as you can see, when this is not happening in your typical Eastern churches. These are camp meetings out west. Some of the biggest groups that are leading this are the Baptists and the Methodists. In general, these camp meetings were very egalitarian. There were white, there were black, there were women, there were men. And thousands of people experienced religious conversions at these camp meetings. And these camp meetings are important. This idea of the Second Great Awakening is important because it sparks a period in the United States of social reform. Now, throughout time, we'll have different times where we see social reform happen. This is one of the first instances. Obviously, we're going to see this again in the progressive movement. Obviously, we're going to see this again. We talk about the civil rights movements of the 40s, 50s, and 60s. But this is one of those first great reform movements that happen. And there's many reforms that come out of that. We have temperance, which is led by American Temperance Society to try to stop drinking. It was led by groups who felt that corruption and vice were ruining the social fabric of America, and this will eventually lead to the passage of the 18th Amendment, which outlaws alcohol in the United States. Also, we see prison reform that happens. This is led by Dorothea Dix, specifically looking at the way the prisons are and speaking about how the fact that there's people who are mentally ill in prisons, that people are not receiving the treatment that they should. Also, coming out of this is the abolitionist movement. It is led by people like the Quakers, Frederick Douglass, William Lloyd Garrison, who writes The Liberator, and David Walker. This movement is going to grow greatly during this time period, and it is going to begin to show that great divide between the North and the South. As our economy grew, so did the demand for slavery in the South. But out of this abolitionist movement, we're going to see the creation of the American Anti-Slavery Society. And this is going to help increase sectionalism in the United States. At this exact same time, coming from the Second Great Awakening, we see the women's rights movement start. Obviously, we have Seneca Falls that comes out of this. To be more effective, women believe that they need more rights for themselves. And so because of that, we see abolitionism and women's rights movements go hand in hand. We see changes in the education system led by Horace Mann, and we see utopian societies emerge. So we have the Mormons led by Joseph Smith at first, and then Brigham Young when Joseph Smith is murdered. He digs up gold plates, he translates it, he says it's the Book of Mormon. at one point, they practice polygamy. He is lynched. Brigham Young then takes over. They take them to Utah, and we will see that they will stop the practice of polygamy because they want to be admitted as the state. We see the Shakers. They're a utopian society that emerges that believe in the equality of women. We see Brooks Farm and the Oneidas. The Oneidas are in Upper New York. They are convinced in the second coming of Christ. So what they talk about is living communally and in perfect equality. They give up all private property and they use complex marriage so that everyone in the community belongs to everybody else. So it was a very unique system that happened way back then. Like I said before, though, we do see this increase of sectionalism that is happening during this time. Innovations in technology impact agriculture and commerce so powerfully that it accelerates the American economy. And this precipitates a profound change to a society and to our national and to our regional identities. So sectionalism continues to plague our country. And we begin to see that regional interests become more important than national concerns. People are not seeing themselves as members of the United States. They are seeing themselves as members of South Carolina. I'm a South Carolinian. I'm a Virginian. I'm a Georgian. I'm a New Yorker. They are not, I'm a, an American. That is not what's existing. As this nation moves west, we can just see more and more this rise of sectionalism. And despite the fact that we do have some increases in nationalism, sectionalism is plaguing our country. So we see the Northeast, we see the Northwest, we see the West, and we see the South. And these four areas really begin to kind of define their own agendas. Okay, and I'm going to talk specifically, when I say the Northeast, the Northwest, the North, when we look at the North, sometimes the Northwest is combined in some Western ideas and sometimes it's combined in some Northern ideas. It just depends on where in the place that we're falling. So I'm going to speak specifically about three because this is a great way to show the huge differences that are occurring between the North, the South, and the West specifically. So the North has its Hartford Convention in 1814 when New England Federalists were considering possible secession due to their anger and resentment over the War of 1812. But by the time they appear to make their arguments known, the war is over and the Federalists begin to fade away. They also have the Second Bank of the United States and the American system that will support it. Jackson is going to veto the rechartering of the bank, and this is going to create that rise of pet banks, and this will divide the Northerners and the Southerners. And we have the protective tariff of 1816. This will be supported by Northern manufacturers, but it's going to be very much resisted by the South. In the South, we have a series of nullification crises. We have the nullification crisis of 1828 and of 1832, when South Carolina votes to nullify both of the tariffs. And this creates a serious problem for Jackson. Like I said, Jackson will order in federal troops, and eventually they'll have the compromise tariff of 1833, also known as the olive branch. But we say it's the olive branch and the sword because obviously he lowers the tariff, but he sends in the federal troops, okay? And we are going to see that he has the force bill. And so that's kind of the sword part. Also, we're going to see South Carolina, again, nullify the force bill. So it is one of those like we're trying to work together, but it's not working so great. The West is going to heavily favor internal transportation improvement. They need roads. They need things to get their goods to market. So of course they want that. That makes sense. But you also have states' rights supporters that are opposed to spending any federal money for these internal improvements. And all of this is going to be part of something we're going to discuss, which is Henry Clay's American system. And then we have the Missouri issue. This is a huge sectional crisis. If you have to write about just one sectional problem, the Missouri issue is a big one you could write about. It is going to divide the North and the South. And the question is, should slavery expand to the West into new states that are being created? The Talmadge Amendment says slavery would be prohibited in Missouri when they entered. But this immediately caused a firestorm in Congress because they wanted to keep a balance of power between the number of free states and the number of slave states within the Union. And this, at this point in 1820, threatens to break the country in two. And it is temporarily solved. It's like a big giant Band-Aid that goes over the issue of slavery with the Missouri Compromise of 1820. So Missouri is made a slave state, but Maine is admitted also as a free state. and they cut off slavery north of the 3630 line. And that what that says is that each state, each part, the North and the South, each have 12 states. And this entire compromise is put together by Henry Clay. So that's one of the reasons why I call him the Great Compromiser, because he's going to do this over and over again. So let's look at some of the identities of some groups of people. We're going to look first at Southern identity. So there is some regional or sectional identity, obviously, that occurs during this time. In the South, the cotton gin in 1793 transforms cotton production. Slavery, many people think it would have naturally died out, but for the invention of the cotton gin, it's what allows cotton to become profitable, and it is what creates the need for many slaves in the South. Owning slaves was a sign of a higher social status. And in this, we see the creation of the Southern plantation, which creates this aristocracy of the South, the planter class of the South. Remember that the majority of Southerners did not own slaves. These people we call yeomen. Yeoman farmers did not have slaves, but they supported the institution of slavery because they believed that they wanted the ability to one day be able to have slaves. So only 25% of Southerners actually owned any, but it was like their dream in order to maybe possibly have a slave one day or multiple slaves, and they did not want that dream extinguished. There's also a code of chivalry in the South. There's a strong sense of honor amongst themselves. We'll see that play out on the Senate floor eventually. And as Northerners became more and more critical of slavery, slave revolts did start to take place. As Southerners became defensive of this. So we will see arguments that emerge about, is this a good or bad system? On the right, you can see an image. Okay, this is a Southern argument. George Fitzhugh is someone who pushes this as an argument that he says slavery is what he calls a positive good, saying that it is better than the factory labor of the North. They often call that wage slaves. And then they also use often religious ideology that defending it that slavery is a positive good in society. So that image on the right is an example of using that idea that slavery is a positive good for society, making the argument that in some way they are treated better as slaves of the South than they were in their own nations. African Americans do continue to try to carve out, though, their own unique identity. So life under slavery is horrible no matter where you live. Please understand that, but understand the experiences are often different depending on where you live and who owns you. So slaves often depended on extended families and surrogate families to resist the inhumanity of slavery and to maintain emotional bonds with one another. During the Second Great Awakening, there is the idea of slave spirituals and religion, and many take on Christianity, but they fuse that with their African religions. And so their version of Christianity is a hybrid of these faiths. There are examples of slave resistance during this time. Do not think that slaves just became slaves and we're like, oh, well, that's what happens. We see sabotage happen. We see they wet seeds to make it impossible for them to grow so that they plant them, but they've already destroyed the seeds before they even put them in the ground. We see that they will slow down. We see they will break tools. They will feign illness, and then they will be out and out. They'll run away, but then there will also be out and out rebellion. A couple of just quick examples of those rebellions are Denmark Vesey in 1822. Unfortunately, before the rebellion can happen, he was betrayed, and with his supporters, he is killed before the rebellion even starts. And then Nat Turner in 1831, he is going to rebel. They will eventually capture him, and he will be killed. By the end of the rebellion, 55 whites are killed. This increases fear across the South. And so because of this, it leads to very strict slave codes being passed in the South that prohibit, for instance, the ability to teach slaves how to read. Now, you are going to see that obviously with all these happenings in the South, there are going to be groups of people that are going to really fight against this. And we call this movement the abolitionist movement. And this movement is going to grow tremendously in the North specifically, where there is a growing free Black population. It is going to be these free Blacks and also some whites who join in this fight. So one is David Walker. He writes something called An Appeal to the Colored Citizens of the World in 1829. And he talks about the importance of fighting back against the inhumanity of slavery. We have the American Colonization Society. Their plan was to slowly free slaves and send the free slaves back to Africa. We have William Lloyd Garrison, who started the American Anti-Slavery Society and called for the immediate emancipation of African Americans. And he writes all about this in his very famous newspaper, The Liberator. And then we have Frederick Douglass, who is a resounding voice for abolition. Then we have Northern identity, which is very different than what's going on in the South. In the North, we have the rise of manufacturing. This starts with Samuel Slater in 1791. He is the father of what we call the factory system. He starts that in Rhode Island. And we have the growth of cities, large cities that start to emerge in the North. So Eli Whitney's interchangeable parts allow for the mass production of goods in factories. Steam engines allow for transportation to be cheaper. An example of that is the Clermont, which is a ship developed by Rob Fulton with a steam engine. We have the development of things like the canal systems. The Erie Canal is a great example, and it allows goods to be shipped farther away. We have the Lowell factory system that begins in Lowell, Massachusetts, which is often worked by New England farm daughters. This will later change to be Irish immigrant women. They are going to work in factories for 8-hour shifts. They're going to live in boarding houses. And this is different because women are working outside the home for the first time. And this is going to change the economy of the North. Now, understand when we talk about the Lowell factory system, and we see what's going on, understand at first, this is farmer daughters who are going to work there for a little bit of time. They're going to find a husband and they're going to leave. This isn't going to be a permanent condition for them. Later, as this factory system emerges more and more and more, especially during the Gilded Age, we are going to see this become immigrant women who work, and this becomes their way of life, even if they're married. They're working in these factory systems. All right. We also see at this time a Supreme Court case that comes out. It's the Commonwealth v. Hunt. And when this comes out, the Supreme Court rules that labor unions are allowed. Through all of this, we see a middle class emerge. And this middle class begins to expand a gap between the wealthy elite and the poor laborers. Who is this middle class? These become the managers, the white collar workers that help, the accountants, things like that, that help these businesses run, but they're not the wealthy owners of these businesses. So it is this small middle class that emerges. Eventually, this middle class will continue to grow and grow throughout history until 1960. That's the high point of the middle class in America, where 60% of all Americans will live in the middle class. And then since then, we've seen that begin to shrink again. As the result of all of this, there are factory jobs created throughout the North, and it's going to attract immigrants to the United States, and they are going to settle in the North. They're not going to go to the South. There are no factories in the South. A lot of them are not farmers. They don't have the money. Even the Germans who are farmers are not going to head to the South. They will go out West instead. So we see two groups during this time period come in large numbers. We see the Irish come, and we see the Germans come. And as you can see right there, that is a political cartoon. Irish whiskey. It says lager beer. The guy on the left is Irish. The guy on the right is German. You can see they're sneaking away with the ballot box. So as you can tell, there is already criticism of immigrants in the United States at this time. So you're going to see the Irish settle predominantly in the East Coast in large cities. And you are going to see the Germans settle, especially out West, as farmers. During this time, we are also going to see the rise of nativism for the first time. Nativism is obviously the idea and belief that they do not like foreigners in the nation, and it's a fight against immigration. We have periods of ebb and flow of nativism throughout U.S. history. And what's going to happen with this anti-immigrant group, especially fighting against the Irish, is going to be the rise of the Know Nothing Party. And they are very much anti-immigrant. Also, at the same time, by the way, you're going to see the rise of minstrel shows, and these are going to be used to mock African Americans. Now, how do they get out West? They get out West because canals and roads are going to encourage their Western expansion. All right, so it is important to remember that even though there is some sectionalism between the North and the South are still tied together. There are some reasons why they still need one another. So, for instance, the South grows the cotton. The North needs that cotton for their textile mills. So, because of it, the two regions are economically linked, and they're linked because of the market revolution. Okay. So, when we see that the linking of the Northern industries with the West and the South creates advancements in things like agriculture, industry, communication, and transportation. And all of this is going to inspire Henry Clay to develop the American system. But also remember that the North and the Midwest are more linked than they are to the South. So that is important to keep in mind. There are different efforts in order to keep the United States together and not to, divide early on in the 1820s and 30s. So we have the Wayne-Hayne debate of 1830 between Daniel Webster of Massachusetts and Robert Hayne of South Carolina. And Daniel Webster in this rejects the idea that the state could defy or leave the Union. And that's where Webster makes that argument. Webster and Clay, remember, besties, and they are going to be firm voices. And when they die, it's going to be one of the reasons why we see these more sane, moderate voices fall apart, and we're going to see more sectionalism rise. Andrew Jackson, though, also rejects the idea that a state can leave the Union when he sends troops in to ensure that South Carolina cannot nullify that federal law. Obviously, that is the nullification crisis of 1832. And here is obviously making fun of South Carolina trying to pull away from the Union. We do see, though, also a rise of nationalism at this time. So do not think that we are just sectional. We also see some nationalistic ideas at this time. There is cultural nationalism where there are patriotic themes and art. So again, we have that Hudson River Valley School, the landscape paintings of the Hudson River Valley that celebrate the beauty of the North American continent. Behind me in the image is one of those such beautiful paintings. We have John James Audubon, who begins the study of birds in America and begins to look at, the environment. We also have economic nationalism, and this is Henry Clay. He is the one that's really going to create this economic nationalism in his American system that I have alluded to numerous times. And what is that? What is the American system that I keep talking about? It is a three-part plan. Very first is that we need a national bank of the United States. This is the second bank of the United States. It was rechartered in 1816. We will see eventually, obviously, Jackson destroy it, but that was the first part. Second part was the protective tariff of 1816 to try to protect American industries and to try to collect money. Why? So we can fund things. What do we want to fund? We want to fund that third part, the internal improvements. And these are to fund things like the Erie Canal and the Cumberland Road, both of which help move goods out west and help connect specifically the North and the Midwest, which is why they are more tied. And then we see political nationalism. Remember, after the War of 1812, there really is just one party, and that is the Democratic Republican Party. The Federalist Party has faded away after the Hartford Convention hurts them, and we call this the era of good feelings. Now, they do adopt some Federalist ideas, which help unite the nation, but there are also disputes during this time, and those disputes are over things like the tariff, over slavery, and over the idea of the bank. There is an American culture that very much emerges during this time. Up until this point, oftentimes we rely on European culture and we just transport it into this nation as our own. That goes away. We now have American culture. So Noah Webster helped create the American English Dictionary, which is the first dictionary published in the United States that is ours and our words. And this is used to standardize spelling and the pronunciation of American English. And this also expands schooling. Obviously, if you talk to someone from England, we speak a slang. Okay, we do. But obviously, Noah Webster and his Webster's Dictionary is what makes that slang American. We also have transcendentalism. It is influenced by European Romanticism. It emphasizes human passion, it emphasizes mystery, and it says that it transcends the power and beauty of nature. One of the leaders of this is Ralph Waldo Emerson. We also have someone like David Henry Thoreau. He writes on Walden Pond, and these ideas of transcendentalism supports temperance and women's suffrage. But we still see rights are denied during this time, specifically to three groups: to women, to African Americans, and to Native Americans. So there are many people who are left out of this new national culture. So when we take a look at women, let's first talk about the cult of domesticity. So the idea of the cult of domesticity is that a woman's place is in the domestic sphere, that women's places are restricted, that they should make the home a place of refuge for their husbands. This is very much a middle class and an upper class phenomenon, though, because working women, very poor women, have to work. Okay, but the cult of domesticity is your middle class, it's your upper class people. It's that picture to the right, the idea of the women making this a sphere of a place of tranquility and of goodness for husbands and for children. But out of that, we also have still that idea of the Republican motherhood. And do not confuse the two. The idea of the Republican motherhood is that women should raise good young citizens to be active, and especially their sons. They need to make sure that they instruct them. So we want women to create this idea that you are going to instruct your sons. You're going to make sure your sons and daughters understand what it means to be a good citizen, but especially your sons, they're going to know how to read and write and learn certain things. Many women were the teachers, so they needed to have a good education, which means that's the reason why girls are educated to a point. They need to have these ideas, but that you create the cult of domesticity. So that as a woman, you're also going to learn, though, the finer parts of being a lady. You're going to make sure that you understand. You're going to teach your daughters, for instance, how to sew, how to cook, and you are the person who's supposed to make this a comfortable and wonderful space for your husbands. During all this, we are going to have the Seneca Falls Convention in 1848, where they are going to publish the Declaration of Rights and Sentiments, where women outline their grievances towards the country, and they are going to begin to demand full and equal rights. It's going to take a hot minute for that to happen. Obviously, it won't happen until 1920s, but that's their call. For African Americans, we see the rise of those pro-slavery arguments that are really starting to happen during this time period from 1800 to 1848, and the whole idea that slavery in some ways some positive good. We also see racism that is going to exist not just in the South. Please remember that racism exists both in the North and the South, and African Americans are completely excluded from this idea of this new national culture. And then for Native Americans, any resistance that they put forth at all during this time is met by their removal, and they are just going to be pushed west. And that leads us to the Native American removal. So by the 1850s, there is a rapid decline in the amount of land that has been lost by Native Americans to the American people, to this new American nation. And there are numerous events that cause this to happen. I gave you a few that really highlight it. So if you have to write about a couple, here's great examples for you. So we have the Battle of Tippecanoe in 1811, where Tecumseh is defeated by William Henry Harrison, and his land has to be given up. We have the first Seminole Wars in 1816 and in 1818 in Florida. And we have that extraordinarily important Indian Removal Act of 1830. Obviously, there was the Supreme Court decision in Worcester v. Georgia in 1832 that said, no, that's their land, you can't take it. Jackson did not care. He went against what the Supreme Court said, and he ordered the removal of the Native Americans west, and their removal of these 5 civilized tribes we call the Trail of Tears. We do see Western expansion during this time. The US interests in increased foreign trade and expanding its national borders helps to shape its foreign policy, and it begins to spur the government and private initiatives. And you can see the population density maps that I provide for you there. Between 1790 and 1820, you can see that move. Obviously, there is a huge move west over the Appalachian Mountains during this time. The size of the United States is going to more than double during this time period. The United States will attempt to increase foreign trade, to expand its borders, and to isolate itself from foreign affairs, especially after the War of 1812. The population density of the United States in 1790 is pretty much hugging that eastern border of our country, but by 1920, our population has gone west. Boston and Philadelphia are still heavily populated areas, but people are moving west for numerous reasons. Number one, the number of natural population growth. We need more land. Also, immigration in the 1830s and 1840s, especially amongst the German and Irish. Ireland is the largest group that immigrates, followed very closely by the Germans, then followed after them by the English. Transportation improvements allow people to go west in things like the Cumberland Railroad, the Cumberland Road, the railroads in the Erie Canal. Railroads are going to become very important. It's starting to emerge during this time period. And then obviously Eli Whitney's cotton gin with the idea of cotton production is going to cause the spread of slavery, which is going to spread populations west as they're looking for more land. Now, we do face a series of national threats, and we slowly are able to remove them. And so, because we are able to remove them, that is really going to help the United States in many ways. These threats are removed. So, one of the things that we have is the Louisiana Purchase in 1803, when Jefferson buys up the property, he doubles the size of the United States. And we do this without having to go to war. So that is super cool. The War of 1812 happens. We are going to fight to a stalemate. This fight is obviously going to be against the English. We stand up against them, and we finally are able to get the British to remove their forts that had been sitting on our territory since the Treaty of Paris. So now we have the elimination of the English as a threat. And in 1819, we get the Adams-Onis Treaty, where Spain finally agrees to sell Florida. And so because of that, our boundaries are expanding. And so does numerous Native American defeats. This really opens up the West and allows us to go west because people are less concerned about what's going to happen to them and their safety. Foreign policy during this time, a couple weird things happening. So we see Jefferson with the Barbary pirates of North Africa. In 1801, Jefferson goes to war rather than pay tribute. They've been asking for bribes. He's like, I'm not doing that anymore. These bribes were used to protect our ships. So he says, no, we're just going to fight. I don't want to do this anymore. It's not a declared war, but it is a war, obviously, that we're doing. We use our Navy to fight the Barbary pirates. And something, by the way, that he had criticized Adams for doing, but then he goes and does it himself. Jefferson then finally debates smaller payments to them, and that's how we end the war. So we still do pay them off, we just give them less money. Obviously, a huge piece of foreign policy is the Louisiana Purchase in 1803, which doubles the size of our country without fighting a war. This will allow Napoleon the cash he needs to keep fighting his war in Europe. And it gives us navigation rights. So he first sends Monroe with $2 million to say, try to get us a port and some pieces, just the port really is what we want, the ability to navigate the Mississippi and have the port. But with Haiti lost, Napoleon says, hey, you can have it all for $15 million. So Monroe comes home and says, I got more than just the port. I bought it all for just $15 million. Jefferson, though, is a strict constitutionalist. So this is going to be, he's a loose, I'm sorry, he's a strict constitutionalist. So this is going to make him very nervous because he does not believe the president really has the power to do this. But he realizes there's really nothing he can do because at this point it's kind of a done deal and it's already been paid for. And so here we have the Louisiana Purchase come in under the person who probably had this happen and another president would have been very critical of it. So now we need to know what all this land has and how are we going to do that? We're going to have an expedition. So we have Lewis and Clark go out in 1804. They travel thousands of miles all the way to the Pacific coast, and they help create maps that give us accuracy of the land in this time, including finding Zebulon Pike, which is a mountain chain. And we're like, oh, that's cool. Why is that important? Because that's going to be a place that people pass west through. We do have the War of 1812, which helps preserve American neutrality. France and Britain are fighting. The United States says we're going to stay out of it, we're going to stay neutral, but our ships keep getting taken, and the British keep impressing our soldiers. And the British are aiding our natives on the western border. So the United States finally decides to declare war. The Federalists are opposed to this idea. We have the Hartford Convention where they argue, those in the North New England area argue that we should break away from the United States. So here we don't have South Carolina arguing to break away. Now we have New England arguing to break away. The Democratic Republicans obviously are for this. We do have the Rush-Bagot Treaty in 1817, where they decide the Great Lakes are going to be disarmed. What does disarmament look like at this time? It means ships. We are going to not have ships. Remember, the War of 1812, a lot of it is fought on the Great Lakes. We do eventually have the British sneak around to the south and burn Washington, D.C., but a lot of it is fought on the Great Lakes, and this is why we have the Rush-Bagot Treaty. We have the British American Convention, happens in 1818, which provides for the joint occupation of Oregon between the United States and Britain for 10 years. And it also establishes the northern boundary of the Louisiana Territory, and that is going to be set at the 49th parallel. And we decide we're going to share fishing rights in Newfoundland. We do have the Adams-Onis Treaty that is done with the Spanish, where we buy Florida, and that will establish our border to the south. And we have the Monroe Doctrine of 1823 that states there will be no more colonization in the Western Hemisphere and that there will be non-intervention by the Europeans in all of the Americas. This basically says we won't intervene in any of your affairs as long as you don't intervene in our affairs. We can't really enforce it at this time, but England never pushes the issue and it doesn't become a problem. And it's going to be the basis for American policy for, over 100 years. And then we see the Lone Star Republic in 1836 and the Texas annexation controversy. The Texans declared their independence from Mexico. No one really knows what to do next, though, because of the issue of slavery. So for a hot minute, Texas is really going to be its own little nation, and we will pick that back up again. And then we also see different areas where when we tried to stay neutral, doesn't really work very well. So we see the Chesapeake Leopold affair in 1807, when the English are attacking our ships. We see the Embargo Act at this time, complete failure. People are still smuggling in goods despite the federal government's ban. We see the Non-Intercourse Act of 1809 and Bacon's Bill number 2, and all of these things end up leading us to the War of 1812. So the United States decides we have to defend our neutrality and we have to deal with the impressment of our soldiers. So they say we have to defend our national honor. This is why it's important. We have to fight the fact that British forts are on US soil. They're violating the Treaty of Paris. We are fighting the fact that Tecumseh and other natives are being supplied guns and things like that. So that makes us extraordinarily upset at this point. And also there's a desire to take land from Canada, war hawks like John C. Calhoun, and also Henry Clay feel like we really could expand US territory. So this war is fought under President James Madison, and it ends with the Treaty of Ghent. So during this time period, can you discuss all of the following ideas that I have listed on these 2 slides? There is a lot of them, so make sure I haven't touched base on all of them. I can't talk about everything, but I've given you some really good ideas overall of can you discuss these things? These are key ideas of things you need for period 4. And finally, can you do this? How did the United States government adapt to changing demographics in the early 19th century? In what ways did the market revolution impact American society? And how did the United States participate in foreign affairs in the early 19th century? So if you can do those things, you are in a good spot for period 4. All right, guys, keep studying.